I'd like to thank Joe Bass and the Heartland Institute for inviting me here today, although I also have to admonish them for not warning me in advance that I'm subject to a fine for using the title of this presentation. I do think that there is a difference between cap and trade and cap and tax in that carbon taxes or cap and trade with auctions necessarily raise revenue, but cap and trade without an auction doesn't. But I would agree also with the Congressman that the difference is more symbolic than real. So I want to ask 4 questions. The first question may shock you because I'm going to consider the possibility that there's an optimal response in some sense, and mostly in an economic sense, to global warming. I'm going to ask the question whether cap and trade can be an optimal response, and then in particular whether Waxman-Markey is the optimal response, and then does cap and trade make sense as a stimulus measure? Now, I have to point out that scientific questions are above my pay grade, as somebody recently and famously put it. I'm not in the business of asking whether the Earth is warming or not or any of that. I'm in the business of taking some scientists' assumptions about the warming that's occurring, if it is, and then translating that into economic effects, and then determining whether or not there's some response that we could take in the policy arena that would bring about a better result for the United States or for the world in general. I have to put it this way. We've heard a lot about junk science this morning used to raise alarms about global warming. Well, let me tell you, there's enough junk economics out there on this subject for me to have all I can do just to stick to that subject. In particular, I have found it necessary to go around the country pointing out that claims about green jobs are all phony claims. It's not about what kind of jobs are going to create. It's about what jobs are going to divert from one activity to another activity. And I've also found it necessary repeatedly to point out that studies done, often at a regional or a local basis, to justify such legislation are utterly deficient on any terms at all, that is utterly deficient in terms of their scientific integrity. And economists do aspire to have scientific integrity in what they say, and I can't go into it now because I have to cover my stuff, but most of the stuff out there is can be dismissed as failing Economics 101 kind of a test. But let's go on. First of all, what does optimal mean? Well, I have to use this technical word, externalities. If the emission of CO2 does nothing to hurt anything, then we don't have to have this conversation today. On the other hand, if it unintentionally inflicts some kind of harm by, let's say, raising global temperatures, bringing about a rise in the sea level, and that in turn inflicts some kind of economic harm, then that's what we call an externality. And economists are in business trying to figure out whether those externalities exist, and if so, how to counteract them. One way to do so would be with a tax and this cap and trade system. A more technical way of putting it is this. Let's look out to the future, hundreds of years if you want, and assume some level of damage, environmental damage done by some assumed level of global warming and so on. Let's figure that's going to happen, and then let's ask the question, how can we improve the outcome in terms of what we call the present value of utility? Now, you remember from Economics 101, it's supposed to mean satisfaction. The author that I'm going to quote here, William Nordhaus, measures it basically in terms of consumption. Adam Smith said the sole end of production is consumption. We buy that. Consumption's a good thing. We want to maximize the present value of that, given that there could be some unintentional harm inflicted as a result of global warming. Now, stimulus is another matter. I was asked to focus on that. I'll say very little about it. But stimulus is about getting out of the current economic slowdown, has nothing to do with what we should be discussing here in terms of an optimal response or an optimal allocation of resources in response to a perceived threat of global warming. So what is cap and trade? Well, the government, in its wisdom, decrees that it wants to put some cap on emissions. And of course, it's a big question whether it's the US government, the government of Massachusetts, the government of California, or the entire world that's putting on the cap, something the Congressman correctly alluded to. And then this cap is put on total emissions, and firms are given the opportunity to auction emission permits to each other. So that firms that find it more costly to reduce emissions purchase emission permits from companies that find it less costly. This optimal policy would involve, as the Congressman correctly points out, an implicit price or fee or tax, if you will. In effect, what's going on, if you think that there's a problem here, is that that is a ton of carbon He imposes a social cost that is not internalized by anybody. William Nordhaus, in his book, A Question of Balance, puts that at $30 a ton. To put this in some perspective, the annual external cost per capita in the United States would be about $150, 5 tons per year per person, and you get a ton of carbon by driving 10,000 miles. And the Nordhaus approach, and I think the correct approach, is having determined that this externality exists to come up with the correct fee, tax, and thus the correct limit on carbon emissions. And you also have to decide between whether you're going to give these grants away or auction them. Here are some proposals before Congress. All of them, I will argue now, awful proposals. The Waxman-Markey is the one that's getting the most attention. Here we indicate what their goals are, what the goals of these proposals are in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And let me move straight ahead to my discussion of Waxman-Markey. This bill has gone through a number of incarnations. We're talking about the discussion draft, which has also been used by the EPA in a recent analysis. Waxman-Markey has some other bells and whistles, clean energy standards, including carbon capture and sequestration, some stuff about energy efficiency, and of course the cap and trade, and then transitioning to an energy economy. I have to say, by the way, that one of the correct things about what Nordhaus does is that he rejects 1, 2, and 4 as silly. We don't deal with this problem by telling people they have to buy light bulbs, which if you drop them are going to emit mercury into the environment and kill the kids and the pets. This is not the correct approach. What you want to do is set the correct price on this carbon if it involves a social cost, and then let the market sort things out from there. So all these other efforts are counterproductive from the point of economics correctly done, in my view. So here's what Waxman-Markey wants to do. I would point out one of the more insidious aspects of this is that it is aiming for its biggest reductions in greenhouse gas emissions off into the future sometime when some of us won't be around or barely around, and it's our kids and grandchildren that'll be having to deal with what they intend to do. 83% below 2005 levels in 40 years, for example. Even they must know this is a preposterous goal, but it's the sort of thing that makes it look good politically. You can satisfy some of the compliance by submitting allowances, planting trees and so on with a sort of 8% penalty. And they have some idea about rebates until 70%, there's 75% compliance around the globe. Now, Waxman-Markey has received high praise from the usual suspects. I just give you some of the authorities here who are waxing ecstatic about it and allow you to read for your own pleasure what they have to say about it. No surprise there. But let's go to Nordhaus. He created what is called the Dynamic Integrated Model for Climate and Energy, or DICE model. I have to tell you that I have had nothing to do with the development of this model. The great thing about this model is it's online for anybody to use who wants to. And we took the model off the internet and decided to run it for the purpose of developing this presentation. Nordhaus himself, in his book, sees the optimal fee or tax at $27 a metric ton. That's that T-O-N-N-E, metric ton, which is about 20% more than a real ton. I would call it chauvinistic, I know. That's what he comes up with for 2005. Importantly, he says, well, it has to be applied across the board, all sectors in all countries, as the Congressman pointed out. If you apply it to just some sectors in some countries, it's entirely counterproductive. As he points out, and as I pointed out, the idea here is to avoid controls and subsidies for green energy and all that sort of fine-tuning. Now, here's the table for which there will be the usual quiz later. The far left-hand column is the economically correct column. It breaks down the analysis between world effects and U.S. effects. So the first set of rows have to do with what these alternative policies how they will impact the world as a whole, and the second set of rows below the first set of rows says what the impacts would be on the United States. So for example, Nordhaus's optimal policy, about which I will give some more detail, would add $3.4 trillion to the welfare of the world in present value terms if in fact it were implemented. Now you have to understand this is the present value of a stream of net benefits going out for hundreds of years. That's what he says his tax, cap and trade, would create in terms of added benefits to the world. If in fact, to go right down this column, if in fact the United States alone were to adopt Waxman-Markey, the effect would be a negative $2.6 billion. That is to say, world welfare would go down by $2.6 trillion if the United States alone were to adopt Waxman-Markey. And it gets worse now, the more countries that adopt Waxman-Markey. So we have to pray that if the United States adopts this legislation, that it doesn't catch on, at least in terms of the welfare of the rest of the world, because it just makes things worse. The damages going up to 3.4 and then 9.5. The net damages in terms of loss of consumption in present value terms. The next set of rows has to do with effects on the United States alone. And here again we ask, what happens if there's the optimal policy adopted worldwide? A little bit of an increase, a $0.62 trillion improvement for the United States. And then what happens to the United States under Waxman-Markey if only the U.S. cuts, if the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development cuts in concert, and if the world cuts in concert. And the OECD, by the way, is a collection of the 30 most important, or almost the most important industrial countries. Because of the pressure of time, I'm a little bit discouraged from going through the additional detail in this table, but I'll just give you a quick look. There is an important column is the very last column. Those represent the present value of the abatement costs associated with all the policies, the optimal policy and the various Waxman-Markey adoptions, both for the whole world and for the United States. And you might look at it this way. If Nordhaus is wrong about the environmental benefits of his policy, and if all the rest are wrong, if these environmental benefits are non-existent, then all those numbers in that far right-hand column represent costs to the world or to the United States. So the worst case scenario is that the whole world adopts Waxman-Markey. There are no benefits, contrary to what Nordhaus assumes, and the world suffers $20.7 trillion loss in consumption in present value terms. The rest of the numbers are arrived at by looking at improvements in the present value of environmental damages and netting them against the abatement costs involved. And I think that in the interest of time, I'll skip this and make myself available by email or any other way that to people who might want to review this. But this table tells all we need to know about Waxman-Markey. I certainly don't know if it tells all we need to know about the optimal policy, because I know that Nordhaus bought into what he called the consensus estimate, the consensus on science on this issue. And as we've heard here today, he may well be wrong about that. But again, that's not something I feel that I can address or want to try. Here's some other ways of looking at what's going on with Nordhaus versus Waxman-Markey. Take a look at the optimal tax as Nordhaus sees it in 2050, 40 years from now, $89 a ton, and Waxman-Markey, $714. Am I running out? How am I doing? 3 minutes? All right, here we go. Hold yourself down. So you see how, again, I don't have to use the pointer. You can see that if you go out the next 90 years, Waxman-Markey has a tax that's about a little more than 3 times what might be the optimal tax, assuming that we buy the story about global warming and its economic damages. Here's something about what these. Let me go back for one quick second. You see the 34, the 53, the 89, and the 202, and then you see the 34, the 122, 714, 778. Let's compare these alternative fees. Let's look at a fee of $34 per ton, 122 or 714. Those fees add to energy prices as indicated in the rows below. That is to say, for example, that the $714 fee, which we see here under 2050 for Waxman-Markey, that $714 fee will add 15 cents, a little bit more than that, to a kilowatt hour of electricity generated by coal, and that kilowatt hour now costs about 9 cents. So there is another way of looking at what the impact would be. This is a little bit about what would happen to global temperatures under Nordhaus's assumptions with and without Waxman-Markey, with and without an optimal response. Again, sensitive as I am to the time, I'll leave that there, and you can get it off of our website, or I imagine Heartland will post this, or you have it in the handout. But it gives you some idea of the differences involved. Essentially, what Waxman-Markey would do is put the world temperature below the optimal world temperature as we go out into the future. There's an optimal temperature, not as high as it would be without a cap and trade, but an optimal temperature that is higher than where it would be if we got legislation such as Waxman-Markey. The EPA is in agreement with our assessment of the taxes or fees that Waxman-Markey would impose. We're looking at $206 to $277 billion in abatement costs, for example, going out into 2050, and the fee is, according to EPA in 2050, from $272 to $352 per metric ton. Is it a stimulus? No, it's not a stimulus. First of all, the cap and trade doesn't go in effect into 2012, and even under this administration, I think the recession may be waning by then. Little dig there. Can't help myself. Anyway, cap and trade, well, this has nothing to do with stimulating the economy. It's like taking over the automobile companies because you think you want to tell people it has something to do with stimulating the economy. It's not part of that. It's part of another agenda. What happens with all of these proposals is that what you're doing is you're steering jobs from one use to another. You're not creating jobs. What you're doing is you're telling people that would like to have big screen TVs and would like to drive safe cars and would like to use the conveniences available to them, that they're better off if you don't make those conveniences available to them. That's what you're telling them, and the burden, of course, is to prove that that's true. And so to answer my questions, yes, there is an optimal response, depending on the science. Yes, cap and trade can be an optimal response. No, Waxman-Markey is certainly not. And no, cap and trade does not make sense as a stimulus measure. So in summary, Nordhaus is an attempt at cap and trade done right. Waxman-Markey is cap and trade done very wrong. It imposes carbon fees that are too high. It pushes the highest fees onto future generations, and it's certainly not the way to do a stimulus. Thank you very much. Pleasure.